Hello, everyone. I'm just waiting to see if more people will join and then we'll begin. It takes a while for people's connection to start sometimes. Hello, everyone. I'm just waiting to see if any more people log on. You're automatically mute, Berta. Thank you for your question. You don't need to do anything to your controls. As long as you can hear me, that's fine. No one's speaking at the moment, Panyan. And no, you don't need to be able to see anyone except me. That was Louisa's question. I hope everyone can hear me okay. We're just going to give it one more minute and then we'll start. People can still join even after it's started. Excellent. Thank you, Laura, for confirming. Laura. Okay, we're going to start now. I'm going to share my screen. So hopefully you will see my PowerPoint appear. Here we go. Okay, so thank you very much for attending my talk. I hope you find it interesting. The chat is not enabled for this session. The questions are enabled, and I see some of you have been using them, which is great. I may or may not have time to answer them at the end, but my email address is on all the slides. If you have a question, please make a note of it and do feel free to email me, and I will try to answer you as best I can. I would also like to say I'm going to talk about a lot to talk about in 40 minutes, and I can't do justice to all the varieties of English spoken in the world. So it's best to concentrate on one, which I know best. Hi. And also, most of the significant developments in English happened before it became a world language. Okay, right. So who am I? So just a bit of information about me. I'm an affiliated lecturer at Cambridge University, and I also work in a school, which is where I am now. Welcome to the History Library. And this is my third time at the language show. So I'm very excited to be here again, and thank you very much for coming along. Okay, so you could be forgiven for thinking that English likes French, Portuguese, Spanish in terms of there being all part of the massive Indo-European language family. They're more like cousins. We can see here on the screen, we've got English is in the same family as German and Dutch. They're sister languages, and they're descended from West Germanic. Whereas, for example, in terms of the Romance languages, they're descended from Latin, okay, over here. So we've got the Romance languages there. But the Indo-European family is really fascinating. It's huge, and it ranges geographically from Ireland in the west all the way to Bangladesh in the east. Okay, so they're related as cousins, but nothing more. And the reason why they look similar is the reason why we often think that English is perhaps related to French in some way genetically, is that it's got a very, very large number of loanwords which come from Romance languages, chiefly French and Latin over the centuries. But I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. So the other Germanic languages, well, we've got East Germanic. Okay, so not much to say about that, unfortunately. They're mostly extinct, languages like Gothic and Burgundian and stuff. The North Germanic languages, they are the Scandinavian languages, so Norwegian, Danish, Icelandic, etc. We're interested in the West Germanic branch, and we've got English right over here, a part of the Anglo-Frisian family, and Frisian is believed to be the closest language to English, and it's spoken now in the Netherlands and in a very small area of northern Germany as well. Okay, so where did it all begin? Well, English hasn't always been here in England. When the Romans arrived, England was Celtic speaking. And the name that we give to the language spoken at the time was Brittonic, sometimes spelled with a double T, sometimes spelled with a TH, as I've put there for you. The Roman invasion began in 43 AD, and when they arrived, they found lots and lots of Celtic tribes, and we can see on the map where the different tribes lived and what their names were. One of the most famous ones is the Iceni, over here in the east, which is where I'm speaking from now, pretty much. And we can, the queen of the Iceni, Boadicea, was famous on Westminster Bridge of London to this day. This is it here. So under the Roman occupation, as everybody already had a language, they already spoke Brittonic, they didn't really need to learn Vulgar Latin, which was the form of Latin that was spoken by the Romans. So we had what we call a diglossic situation. That's where we've got a situation with two languages operating. And an early Briton, an ancient Briton, would have maybe needed to learn Latin if he or she had dealt directly with Romans, maybe if he or she had lived in a town or been involved with trade with the Romans, but otherwise there wasn't really that much of a need to learn Latin. So the Brittonic language endured in England during that time. When the Roman occupation ended, and it didn't end overnight, it is believed to have begun in about 410, and then it went on for quite a long time after that. They gradually withdrew. Vulgar Latin withdrew as well. And then the Celtic speakers remained, the speakers of Brittonic remained. Unfortunately for the ancient Britons, this wasn't the end of the occupations, it was just the beginning. And no sooner had the Romans gone, that Germanic tribes arrived in their place. And so from about 440 onwards, we start to see more and more people arriving from these areas, these coloured areas here. Okay, whoops, I've just moved the picture of myself. These coloured areas here, okay, and what is now northern Germany and Denmark. And they all came over the north. And the tribe that gave their name to this country, they were the Angles, okay, and they settled this eastern area here. Engla is of the Angles. It's a genitive form. And the Celts didn't really have as much linguistic prestige as the conquerors. But very often when we get what's called a language shift situation, where a population goes from speaking one language to speaking another, there's a prestige element involved. And the language that is adopted tends to have more cultural prestige, maybe the speakers have more economic prestige. The language is somehow perceived as being superior, or the speakers are somehow perceived as superior. The German tribes identified as one ethnicity, but they weren't very linguistic century. The country had been unified, Briz had emerged, and we can see the dialect areas here. Okay, the West Saxon dialect, spoken down in the southwest of England, that came to the fore as the most important literary dialect during the Anglo-Saxon period. However, Anglian, if we go back a little, Anglian is which was the form of it was the Germanic dialect which was brought to this area of the country. That was actually the ancestor of modern English. We know this because we can trace certain phonological patterns back in time. For example, looking at diphthongs before certain consonant groups, those show us that the closest related language, the closest related ancestor to Old English, or modern English even, is Anglian. So the story didn't end there, the story of invasion. So once Germanic tribes had been there for a few centuries, and then the Danes arrived, okay. They first attacked England in about 800, and they came to plunder originally, and then they came to actually occupy the country. And part of the country was known as the Danelaw, this pink area here, which was the area which was under Danish control, essentially. Old English, so that was the language that had emerged, okay, during the time after the Germanic invasions. Old English and Old Norse were quite similar. Okay, so they were even mutually intelligible a lot of the time. And during that time, the Danish invaders actually integrated. They married local people. They adopted the language. People started mixing between Old Norse and Old English, and the two languages kind of merged. And then Old Norse eventually died out. So it didn't. But the biggest mark left by Old Norse was vocabulary, as we'll see here in a minute. So now we're into the Old English period, and the Old English period is usually considered to go from about the 8th century to about the 11th century, just before the Norman conquest. Old English was very, very different from modern English, and we often think of modern English as being quite simple. It's got no grammatical gender, it's got no case endings, a lot of the verb forms are the same throughout a paradigm. It was completely different in Old English. So the alphabet was different for a start. The Roman alphabet was used, but also the certain runic symbols were used as well. For example, the TH sound, th, was written using thorn or F, those symbols which we've got here, okay? To say a, to write a, you might have used ash, this sign here. This one that looks a bit like a P, that's a bit deceptive. It's actually a W, and that was called win. And then this rather funky one here, that was the yog, and that was used for writing a G. It was highly inflected cases, so nominative, accusative, genitive, dative, rather like in Latin, Greek, German to this day. It had 3 genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter. And it also had, within those noun cases and those genders, we had different classes of nouns, so that complicated things even more. In modern English, we know that we've got words like man and men, goose and geese. There were lots more of those in Old English, and we call those stem mutations. It's when the central part of a word changes, usually the vowel changes, depending on what the word's doing in a sentence. They only had 2 verb tenses. The word order was fairly flexible. You could put words pretty much wherever you liked in the sentence. Now, going back to Old Norse, so although Old Norse didn't actually overtake English, it left a massive legacy in terms of borrowings. There are believed to be about 400 Old Norse words which have survived into modern English. Okay, and that might not sound like very many, given that a native speaker has maybe 20,000-30,000 words in their vocabulary. But these are really, really important words. They're core borrowings, things like egg, sky, die, even are, or they. It's quite rare for a language to borrow pronouns, but that shows the extent to which Old Norse kind of penetrated English. It didn't replace it, but it gave us these really, really important borrowings that we use to this day, okay? Now, Old English looked and sounded very, very different from now. Just the appearance of it here, you can tell there are a lot of letters that look a bit unfamiliar. I'm going to read it in the way that it would have been pronounced at the time. I'll do my best anyway. And we're going to talk a bit about what it consists of. It's mit min kun. It's lufia min quen for tham fe heu gethulig is. Min suno is snotter knicht. We habas et kraddelchild. Min eldmoder on the dies mit us. Heu is 65 year old. So that's talking about myself, okay? I live in Gruntabridge, so that's what the Anglo-Saxons called Cambridge. The Normans struggled with that word apparently, and they changed it. I don't know if that's true. A town which Cambridge is called, so the word order is different from modern English. It's called is at the end. With my family, okay? The word kin is no longer used for family except in next of kin. We've got a Romance word for that now. I love my quen, my wife. So the word queen used to mean a wife or any woman. It's now just the queen, okay? Because she is patient. Again, we don't use the word gethulig anymore. We use a Romance word. And also we've got the verb at the end. My son is a clever lad. Knicht used to be any young man. Now it's a knight specifically. We also have a cradle child, a baby. That's such a good word. We don't use the word cradle child anymore, which is a shame. My eldmoder, so we've changed that now to grandmother. Old mother's not very flattering, we have to admit. Okay, so that's another Romance word that's come in, lives with us. She is 5 and 60 years old. So that's a significant element of which has changed. We've reversed the order of tens and units in English now, and that's due to various reasons. Some people believe it's to do with it's a contact-induced phenomenon. So when English came into contact with French during the Norman occupation, the order of numbers changed, and also because it reduces your mental cost. If someone says 5 and 60, after they've said 5, you're thinking 5 and what? 5 and 20, 30, 70, it's quite stressful. If they say 60, you're then down to there can only be one of just 10 numbers coming afterwards. From a cognitive point of view, it's a bit easier to work out what's going on. But that was a change that took ages to be completed, about 700 years, in fact. Okay, so Norman England, right? So one of the key dates in English history is 1066, when William the Conqueror tried his luck and succeeded, in fact. People often think of the Anglo-Saxon period as being the Dark Ages. So it was a time when not much happened. Maybe it wasn't very civilized. Actually, that's completely wrong. The Anglo-Saxons they had a very, very sophisticated literary tradition. They were great craftsmen. They were renowned for their scholarship, their arts, and things like that. But the advantage the Normans had over us was their cavalry and their castles, their warfare, essentially. So, the Anglo-Saxons didn't have a chance. The native aristocracy was destroyed, and the Normans swept in, and the influence of the Normans was present in Britain for a very, very long time. Okay. So the Normans they were Scandinavian, like many of our previous settlers. Okay, they were the descendants of Nordic pirates who travelled from Scandinavia to France, where they integrated. They settled in France in about the 8th century. And they were only interested in territorial annexation when they came to Britain. They weren't really interested in making everybody speak their language. So we can see that in Norman Britain, there was actually a triglossic situation. So not 2 languages, but 3 were being used. Anglo-Norman was found in law, administration, schooling, etc. Latin was found in slightly higher functions, things like higher education, international communication, and whatnot. But English was the kind of everyday language that everybody carried on speaking. It's what we might call a basilect. Okay, so we have an acrolect, which is a high language. That was a Latin, okay, at the time. And the basilect is a lower language. So it's kind of just a language of the people that people are going to use in their daily activities. And also, again, that there wasn't necessarily very much mixing for everybody. It was a bit like under the Roman occupation. An English person might have only needed to learn Anglo-Norman, which was the French that was spoken in Britain at the time, if he or she had had direct dealings with the Normans. Many people at this time were bilingual, but not everybody. Okay, and we have to remember there was at the time a very large rural peasant class who maybe didn't really come into contact with people with Normans and really didn't need to speak their language necessarily. And crucially as well, the Normans weren't really interested in using their language to build a nation. They just wanted to expand their territory. Now, the biggest influence that Anglo-Norman had on English was the vocabulary. And this is why, going back to the family tree, why people often think that English and French must be related in some way. There's a vast number of Anglo-Norman cognates. Around 10,000 words came into the language during the Norman occupation, which doesn't sound like an awful lot, but if we go back to that figure of 20 to 30,000 words in the average adult native speaker's vocabulary, then that could be half of your vocabulary could be made up of Norman words. And we can see there all the different fields that they fall into. And quite sadly, it's estimated that up to 85% of original English words were lost due to Norse borrowings and then subsequently Anglo-Norman borrowings. Sad times. So why is it that we are not all speaking French right now, you may ask? Numerous reasons. Okay, the Normans were outnumbered. As I've said, there was a huge English-speaking working class. Okay, they weren't even bilingual. They didn't really need to be. The Normans were outnumbered, and from a linguistic point of view, that was not good news for them. The plague changed the linguistic divisions between the public and the rulers. It also wiped out a lot of the urban population, and a lot of the Anglo-Norman speakers would have been in towns rather than the countryside. Also, a lot of other political things happened. King John lost the dukedom of Normandy, so the two countries kind of grew apart politically. The 100 Years' War, that didn't do a lot to make people really like French in England and really want to learn French. There's also anti-French sentiment. Things like the Statute of Pleading, that was a law that was brought in to ensure that English would be the language of law courts from now on. So English started to be used in an important official function, which hadn't been the case before. Okay, and bit by bit, Anglo-Norman faded and English kind of clawed its way back. And also Anglo-Norman began to be seen as a bit rustic and provincial and not really very cool. The variety spoken in Paris was increasing in prestige, again, for social, cultural and political reasons. And anyone wanting to know French wanted to know that variety rather than the rather rustic variety that was being spoken in England. So there were lots of things going on at that time that led to English standing its ground. Now, Middle English. So Middle English is a term that is given, it's very difficult to periodize any language into sort of Old English, Middle English, etc. Because obviously a language doesn't change overnight. It doesn't stop being Old English one day and become Middle English the next day. These changes take a long time to occur. But usually we consider Middle English as being from the Norman conquest, so 1066, up to about the late 15th century. So what happened when the Normans were in charge? Remember that a lot of the scribes would have been Normans, and they got rid of the runic symbols for a start. And in fact, our digraphs, our consonant combinations like TH, GH, and W, they emerged during Norman times when they got rid of the runes. Inflection started to disappear as well for various reasons. Certain forms and endings were generalized across genders and cases, so it became a general way of referring to an inanimate object. The word the became a generalized article as well. Because we weren't using cases anymore, we had to use prepositions more to show whether it was for or by or to or of somebody. So the word order had to become more rigid as well, and that was when the subject, verb, object order began to emerge. We also started to get verb tenses with auxiliaries. Remember, we didn't have a present, we had a present and past, didn't have a future tense. That began to emerge in Middle English with auxiliaries like shall and will. The printing press arrived in England during this period as well, and that was crucial in the language beginning to be standardized so that everybody could read and write it, kind of on the level playing field. And also the so-called East Midlands dialect, which is a bit of a misleading name. It's really the area between Oxford, Cambridge and London. That was starting to emerge as a kind of a standard. So to put in perspective, to kind of make it, to put in perspective how Old English and Middle English were different, I'm just going to read another little passage. This is an extract of the Vision of Piers Plowman written in the 14th century. I make no apologies for the font, because as you can see from the picture, that is very much the kind of font that scribes used to write in at the time. And it sounds a bit like this. In a sommersäsong, on sommar was the sonna, I sjubminter schrudes as shepwera, inhabite as an hermite, and holy of workers, went to weeder in this world wondrous to hera. I gonna me moweniga on Malwena Hillers, me befilla fairly, of ferry methorta. I was wary for 100 and went to Mitteresta, under brood bank be a borna sida. And as I lay and Lenada and looked on the waters, he slumbered into a sleeping, it swayed Somuria. So we can see, for example, that's a few examples of how the language has changed. Because this font's a bit difficult to read, if you have a U before an M or an N, it makes it very difficult to decipher it, okay? So one of the things that the scribes did at that time was change the Old English U, which we have in modern English actually, in summer and sun. They changed it into an O to make it easier to read. Also, we've got the reflexive pronoun myself hadn't appeared at this time, and just an ordinary object pronoun me was used, like oferie me torta, went me to resta, shop me into schrudes. Okay, so that myself was an element that appeared quite a bit later on. But it's already, compared with the Old English passage, it's already starting to look and sound a little bit more like modern English. Okay, well, there are still, however, a great many differences. And you might be wondering, why was early English pronunciation so different from modern English? Maybe you've perhaps heard a Shakespeare play in original pronunciation. I'll talk about that in a minute. And you might wonder, how did all these changes come about? Well, the biggest change to happen in English pronunciation was the Great Vowel Shift. And this went on for a very long time. Again, none of these things happen overnight. This started in about the 1400s and went on to about the 1600s. And during this time, the vowels all became a bit higher and closer. So when we talk about high and close with a vowel, we're talking about where in the mouth it's pronounced. if we have a look at this little vowel quadrilateral here, okay, so if we say, this is the ah sound, a bit like in hat, if we say ah, and I'm exaggerating here, ah, our mouth is open and our tongue's quite low down, ah. Just going to move the pitch of myself a bit, there we go. If we say, for example, or e or e, as we do that, our tongue rises a bit in our mouth. Compare ah and e, ah, e. So our mouth is in a different position, and basically that's what was happening. And this diagram shows how essentially the vowels kind of changed position. It's like they were playing musical chairs, I once heard somebody say. And so this one, for example, it moved up. It stopped being ah and it became eh. That one sort of stopped being eh and became eh. And that one stopped being eh and became e. And then that one became a diphthong. And they all kind of went round in a circle, if you like. So to put that in perspective, it's a little bit technical. The word nama in Old English, okay, name. Nama became name, and then name, and then name in the modern day English. We then got beta, bite. Beta became bite, which is what we have nowadays. The word meat, okay, has changed in two ways. We've got one kind of meat and another kind of meat. They changed differently. We went from met to mate to meat. And this one went from mate to meat. The word house was originally hundreds of years ago pronounced hoose. It went from hoose to hoose, hearse, house. Okay, so it was a very, very long kind of change shift process that went on, and as it wasn't completed until nearly the beginning of the end of the 17th century, in fact. Okay, also some sounds hadn't actually come into English yet. For example, ing and je, these sounds here, like having sing and leisure, they hadn't appeared yet. A lot of now silent letters were still being pronounced. The word knicht, which was in the Old English passage, we now say night, okay, and right, that would have been ritter. Very tricky to pronounce that initial W, but that used to be there. And then there were some sound changes that simply hadn't happened at this point. Words like, for example, enough, okay, that in Old English was ginog, probably inoch in Middle English, and still that ch hadn't finally changed to a f by this time. So there was an awful lot going on. Okay, so if you've ever seen a Shakespeare play, I'm sure most of you have at some point, you may well have heard it performed in received pronunciation, which is very much like what I'm speaking at the moment. It's kind of what we consider to be standard English or BBC English, or sometimes the Queen's English, but the Queen's got her own form of English, so that's not really that's not a very good definition. But actually, received pronunciation didn't exist. It arose in when people spoke in a very, very different way. Thomas Campion was an immediate contemporary of Shakespeare. He lived at exactly the same time. And I'm just going to read here a little, one of his song lyrics. He was a lutenist. I'm going to read out one of his lyrics, and we'll see what differences there are in pronunciation. "E that will up of true delight, with virtue must be graced. Sweat fully yields a bitter taste, whichever will appear at last. But if we still in virtue delight, our souls are in heaven placed." So there are a few things going on. The H, E, and up wasn't pronounced at the time, okay? The I, diphthong, hadn't emerged. It would have been more like delight, okay? Virtue, so all these sounds like we get in bird, heard, curse, for example, they were pronounced pretty much as they were written. Virtue, it would have been. So going back to this great vowel shift, at the time, it wouldn't have been sweet, it would have been sweat, something like that, sweat and yells, okay? Tast, not taste, because the so-called face diphthong didn't exist at the time. We've got tast, which would have rhymed with last, okay? So it's only when we use the original pronunciation that the rhymes work, and that's crucial in songs or in poetry. And then we've got virtue and delight here again, yeah? Two really important people in terms of Shakespeare's English are Ben and David Crystal. Ben is David Crystal's son. David Crystal is an absolute legend in linguistics. I'll talk about him in a minute. Ben Crystal is a Shakespearean actor, and he regularly takes part in original pronunciation performances at the Globe Theatre. If you look up Ben Crystal original pronunciation on YouTube. You can find lots of his interviews where he goes into massive detail about this. But one interesting thing that he said was that when you perform a Shakespeare play in original pronunciation, it's shorter. Okay, it takes less time than received pronunciation, and he also said that the dialogue is much punchier. It's a bit more sort of vigorous and bold. Okay, John Dowland was another lutenist, a contemporary of Shakespeare, and he was a bit like the James Blunt of his time. He was terribly miserable all the time. His mistress was constantly abusing him and distressing him. And if you sing his lyrics in received pronunciation, they sound very bright and happy. White as lilies was her face, when she smiled she beguiled, quitting faith with foul disgrace, virtue's service thus neglected, heart with sorrow hath infected. If you were to sing them in original pronunciation, not only would they rhyme properly, as Dowland intended, but I think the bitterness that poor John felt really comes across. White as lilies was her face, when she smiled she beguiled, quitting faith with foul disgrace, virtue's service thus neglected, heart with sorrow hath infected. I rest John's case. Okay, moving on. So, what happened next? Well, even after the great vowel shift, it still wasn't the end of the story, excitingly. And major pronunciation changes, however, by about the late 17th century had pretty much been completed. If you were to listen to an original lyric of the composer Henry Purcell, who was writing exactly 100 years later than Shakespeare, Dowland and Campion, the only differences you might notice would be the rhotic R is still there, the R, which you heard in the previous lyric, and also the so-called face diphthong, face, not face. The face diphthong that we have now wouldn't have emerged. So you'd have heard and a lot of the time. Incidentally, the rhotic R, that's a very, very salient feature of earlier periods of English, but it's not just confined to early English. It's now found in modern English all over the world, in parts of Britain, in America, in Jamaica as well. There are many parts of the world which it's been exported. Okay, so spelling had been largely standardized by this time, but there was actually a lot of disillusionment about spelling. William Bullicar, for example, he's mentioned down here. He was a schoolmaster who was very disillusioned by his pupils' difficulty with spelling things, and he proposed a new spelling system called the Book at Large, and it was based on diacritics, by adding sort of little squiggles and symbols to existing letters. But it was very, very hard to use, and it didn't really catch on. Also, Jonathan Swift, somewhat later, he proposed a publication called A Proposal for Correcting, Improving and Ascertaining the English Language. And he demanded that an academy should be set up to regulate English, rather like the Académie Française in France, which had been established about in the previous century. But that didn't catch on either. I don't think we have a very prescriptive mindset in Britain. But that was rather an ideology that was rather coming to the fore at that time. There'd been all these sound changes, but spelling hadn't necessarily changed to keep up with them. And people were starting to think, hang on, should we change things? The spelling system isn't very good. We ought to maybe control the way that the language is developing. And so, yeah, quite a lot of experimental spelling systems came up at that time as well. John Wilkins, for example, he developed a spelling system and even a new language. And an undergraduate student of mine once tried to write half of his essay in John Wilkins's new language. It didn't go terribly well. And then we've got a new pronouncing dictionary, which was devised by John Walker, the critical pronouncing dictionary here. So it was a time when there was quite a lot of commentary on the English language, and spelling was starting to be seen as a bit of a problem. But as we know to this day, nothing's really changed. People complained at the time, but nothing really happened. Meanwhile, the London dialect was continuing to gain prestige. It was a centre of the publishing industry, among other reasons. There was the King James Bible that had been published. It was the first Bible in English, and it was considered a major, quite influential publication. Samuel Johnson's dictionary, that was considered a very, very pioneering dictionary at the time. And then Noah Webster published an equally pioneering dictionary in America, somewhat later, at the beginning of the 19th century, which was designed to reflect American usage and to kind of own American English and sort of present it as a variety in its own right. Something else that happened in this, I think we could call the early modern period, so after, around the time of the Renaissance and subsequently, was an enormous influx of vocabulary. So during Renaissance times, anything Latin related was prestigious. Okay, and that's reflected in the very, very large number of words that came into the language at that time. And a lot of them were derided. Remember, this is quite a prescriptive era, and people didn't really like all these words coming in. And some of them were deemed utterly ridiculous and pompous, and there was a great deal of criticism of them. But some of those words were things like spurious, reciprocal, okay, stupendous, which are words that we use to this day, and we find them completely normal. But at the time, they were derided as the so-called inkhorn terms, you know, and only a very affected, snobbish person would have used them. So our attitudes have changed. As the vocabulary has become integrated into the language, our vocabulary has changed completely. Fun fact about Benjamin Franklin. So he was a founding father of the United States and a polymath, very, very clever man. When he wasn't out flying kites and thunderstorms, he was creating new alphabets. This is just an alphabet that Benjamin Franklin proposed to try and get around the spelling problem. And this is a letter that one of his admirers wrote to him in his own alphabet. So that's quite cool. Right, now English at this time, so during the early modern period, from the kind of Renaissance period onwards, English was busy being exported to other parts of the world. This is the Mayflower setting sail for the New World. And this map shows the British Empire to its greatest extent. America's not shaded because it had gained its independence at that time. And it was really through colonization and trade that English became the world language that it is today. And as we can see, many of these places which are highlighted in pink are now Anglophone countries, or countries where English is maybe an official language or has a very, very strong presence or a very high level of prestige. It's worth saying that within all these areas where English is now spoken, here they are again, so this is English language around the world, within each of those areas, English it's not a homogeneous entity. Okay, so within America, there are different regional accents, there's different regional vocabulary. Same thing happens in Australia as well. In parts of Africa, throughout the continent, you don't just find one English, you find lots of different types of English. And also the kind of English spoken, say in Jamaica or in America or in New Zealand or West Africa, reflects to an extent the type of English that was exported there by the original settlers. That's partly why we find rhoticity, the R, father, not father, in many parts of the English-speaking world. That's the variety that the settlers would have taken there with them, okay? Other things which influence different ways in which English has developed around the world are the substrate languages, so other languages which already exist or continue to exist in those areas. Also language policy. So what has been the attitude of settlers and subsequent governments and current governments with regard to how people use language, for example, in education and things like that. Okay, so English has developed in a very different way in different parts of the world, depending on the context in which it's found. Now, it's all very well to say, oh, great, you know, it's this really wonderful language, you know, it's spoken by some estimates say up to 1.5 billion people around the world, even though most of them are not native speakers. But actually, the propagation of English around the world has come at a huge cost. 60 plus indigenous languages in Canada threatened by the existence of the presence of English. I've read that when the settlers arrived in America, there were closer to 300 indigenous languages now threatened by English. Ireland, Irish is threatened. Cameroon, there are 250 indigenous languages. A lot of people would rather learn English or French, so there's another strong colonial language there as well. Australia, 250 indigenous languages threatened. And in New Zealand, where once probably everybody spoke Maori or related languages, now only a minority do, and very often not as a mother tongue. We can't talk about a language killing another language. A language is an inanimate object. It can't go around killing things. But in many places, language shift has taken place. Speakers have decided, for whatever reason, usually prestige, which was the case, you know, when you know the Germanic tribes arrived in England. Prestige operated then. That meant that the Celtic inhabitants stopped speaking their own language and they started to speak the Germanic languages instead. So prestige is working still now, centuries and centuries later. And a government can't tell you what language to speak in your own home, but you can make that decision. And so speakers all over the world, for various reasons, are shifting increasingly towards English and away from their from their country's indigenous languages. Okay, one thing which is quite interesting which came out of that is English lexifier Pigeons and creoles. There are about 200 Pigeons and creoles in the world, and about 40 of them have a vocabulary based on English. These are contact languages which arise in situations typically where there's been trade involving people from different language groups who haven't been able to communicate and have devised a pidgin, a simplified language form with which to communicate with each other. Okay, a creole is when that language starts to be learned as a mother tongue. Okay, and we've got various examples. We've got Vanuatu where Bislamaya is spoken. We've got Toksin. And then we've got, even the BBC has a Pigeon news channel now, which caters mainly for speakers in Nigeria. Into the modern age, well, received pronunciation emerged in the 1890s, okay? And that is kind of what's often viewed as standard English, okay? It's associated with Oxford and Cambridge and the boys' public schools, the traditional public schools. And that was the foundation for Daniel Jones's English Pronouncing Dictionary. And also it was the BBC Broadcasting Standard in the 1920s. That's completely changed. We've got urban multi-ethnolects like urban British English and multicultural London English appearing now, where you've got people with all different sorts of mother tongues coming together and producing a different variety of English. We've got people like Neil Nunes, who is a Jamaican broadcaster who now appears regularly on the BBC. That wouldn't have happened 100 years ago. It would have been impossible, but broadcasting is really diversified now in the modern age. Is English still evolving? Yes, all the time, okay? Particularly vocabulary. The vocabulary is really, really productive and innovative, and we've got lots of things here. Blending is where you take half of one word and half of another, join them together. This animal's a puggle. Who knew? A pug and a beagle. Compounding, join two words together. Acronyms, okay, so CARE package was actually an acronym, the Cooperative for American Remittances to Europe. Derivation and affixation, we add a suffix or whatever. Foreign borrowing, we don't do that as much now, but we still occasionally do in the field of things like popular culture and technology, Japan being a major source of borrowings at the moment, it would seem. Change of function, so you can gift something to someone now, you can ghost somebody, something can be cringe, things have changed their function in sentences. And also we've got, for example, regularization of paradigms. Human beings like regularity. Why do all our past participles, or nearly all of them, end in an ED? But there are some like learnt and meant and spelt which don't. So increasingly, those are moving over from a T to an ED. We've also got a singular they, which obviates having to say he and she all the time, okay? The second person plural, you guys. We used to have a way centuries ago of saying you plural, now we haven't. So you guys has been introduced to kind of get around that. Also, analogy again, I don't have is becoming much more popular than I haven't got, because it's like I don't like and I don't know. It fits in with other negatives that we use. Also, fewer is being used much less and less is being used a lot more, if that makes sense. Okay, we wouldn't grammatically in the past have talked about less books, we'd have talked about fewer books, but less is starting to take over. And I am also seeing an increase in the present progressive tense. Okay, I am doing, I am seeing, I am liking this, I'm not liking this. We're using that more and more now. Okay. Right, we're almost out of time, but I just want to tell you about some really, really interesting publications. I would 100% recommend anything written by David Crystal. He's a complete legend. He's written all about the English language. If you search up David Crystal English, you'll find a host of really accessible, interesting things to read. And I put here a few more suggestions. Charles Barber and Peter Trudgill are other great writers as well. And I hope you found that interesting. I'm so glad I got through 1400 years in 45 minutes. We're going to be out of time for questions. I'm very sorry about that. Please take down my email address and I'd love to hear from you if you want to learn more. Thank you so much for watching.